Hello, my name is Pat Montana. I grew up at 247 Mulberry Street during the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the apartment where the FBI nabbed John Gotti. I was always intrigued by a story I read about a Mulberry Street gangster who shot two patrolmen and a mobster a few buildings down from 247 Mulberry Street. My podcast is entitled Murder and Mayhem on Mulberry Street. It's a unique true gangster story. I decided to research the incident and uncovered stories in the World newspaper dated Sunday, May 4th, 1913. Now that's over 110 years or more ago, entitled Policeman Slain in Mulberry Street, Another Dying. The shooting had occurred the night before at 11:50 p.m. The Monday headline read, Italian slayer of two policemen, hunted by all their comrades. The Tuesday edition of the World read, Hunt for slayer of three extends all over nation. My mother's family lived across the street at 250 Mulberry Street and heard the shots and witnessed all the commotion from their windows. In fact, I interviewed my uncle in the late 1970s, now deceased, who knew the story behind the killing of the mobster and the unfortunate patrolman, and he related it to me. He actually spoke to the baker's son the next morning at 241 Mulberry Street, where the killer and his family lived, who told him he knew who committed the murders. It was Oresto Shilatani, alias the Paperbox Kid, alias Harry Shields. Of course, he would never admit it to the police. I could never forget the story and tell it to the many friends in the neighborhood to this day, but no one really knows about it. However, in 2015, while conducting more research about the incident, I discovered a manuscript online written by the gangster's great-nephew, John Shilatani, entitled Gangster Original, The Untold Story of a One-of-a-Kind Mulberry Street Mobster. Reviewing long and forgotten family photos, family archives, evidence, articles, and transcripts, the manuscript is fascinating and reveals the gripping saga of murder and mayhem on Mulberry Street. I lived within 50 yards of the buildings, from 235 to 241 Mulberry Street, where the murders occurred. Most of these buildings were owned at that time by the Shilatanis, which I discovered while reading his manuscript. The purpose here is to introduce and highlight what the apartment buildings next to 247 Mulberry Street, where I lived, were like during that time, and to introduce the reader to the story of this unique gangster, Oresto Shilatani. In fact, I used to climb the rooftops and backyards of these buildings as a youngster and can relate vicariously to this crime. The background and thinking leading up to these murders on Mulberry Street are well detailed in John Shilatani's manuscript, and the Paperbox Kid gave himself up to the police after a nationwide hunt and was sent to Sing Sing prison. The New York Times on June 22, 1916 reported that Shilatani shoots guards, escapes the death house. Apparently, he was the only one who ever survived initially at that time and escaped from the death house at the world's most notorious prison. The Mulberry Street buildings on the cover of this memoir was where it all happened, next to my apartment at 247 Mulberry Street. Some background on the Mulberry Street district at the time. According to John Shilatani in Gangster Original, and I quote, in the decade of the 1910s, the Mulberry Street district in New York City was an amazingly violent place with an ever-mushrooming and thriving criminal element. The Mulberry Street District became the greatest breeding ground for the toughest and baddest criminals in the world. Italians upon Italians were crammed into this tiny section of the relatively small island of Manhattan. Mulberry Street was where it all started. The very first family, I should say, of the great Italian immigration came to live on Mulberry Street in 1913. In a short time, Mulberry Street became the avenue of the stars for gangsters. The biggest and most influential who's who of Italian-American gangsters lived, worked, killed, or got killed on Mulberry Street. The Teflon Don, John Gotti, and the Gambino crime family were headquartered at 247 Mulberry Street. In fact, I remember as a youngster, before it became the Ravenite Cafe, it was called the Alto Nights, and it was owned by my grandfather. Eventually, it became the Ravenite when Gambino came down to, was the boss of the crime family. And I knew the Ravenite intimately because I worked there as a youngster. I made homemade lemon ices and coffee ices at the cafe, which was a hometown kind of a cafe for people who worked in the neighborhood and wanted a coffee or a lemonade during the hot summer months. And so I worked and was very familiar with that facility at that time. But John Gotti wasn't the only tough guy on Mulberry Street. Many other tough, hardened gangsters roamed the so-called Promised Land throughout the great history of New York City. According to Shilatani, just to name a few, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, Giuseppe Morello, Giuseppe the Boss Masseria, Vito Genovese, Joseph Bonanno, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, and Frank Costello. Two longtime and popular mafioso called Mulberry Street their home, and Agnello Della Croce, underboss of the Gambino family, lived at 232 Mulberry Street for over 45 years, from 1914 to the 1960s. In fact, I served as the altar boy at O'Neill's wedding. Another mafioso, Peter DeFeo, was capo of the Genovese family, lived at 276 Mulberry Street. I knew him as an acquaintance, but that's the most I can say about him. Before the five families and before the La Cosa Nostra were kings of New York, the gangster original and his family came to America to live and to own really a big piece of Mulberry Street. The section of the Mulberry Street district set between Canal Street to East Houston Street has been called the Promised Land of American gangsters. It housed leaders of the toughest and most feared organizations in the United States. The Neapolitan Gomorrah, the Sicilian Mafia, the Black Hand. The gangster original and his family owned many tenements side by side, one of which was right next to 247 Mulberry Street. 60 years before it was better known as the Gambino family headquarters, known as the Raven Night Social Club during the 70s and 80s. In fact, in my original memoir, which I wrote some time ago, was entitled 247 Mulberry Street, describes what it was like growing up there during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So-called mobster experts, the certified and self-proclaimed, haven't mentioned a word of this tough-as-nails Mulberry Street gangster, according to John Shilatani. Wikipedia, which has otherwise done an outstanding job giving us information about everything and anything on this planet, missed this one. According to Shilatani, it is beyond the realm of possibility that a mobster and his family that dominated the card games, saloons, numbers, gun trade, bootleg wine, false docks, and counterfeiting in this section of Mulberry Street for so long, from 1904 to 1918, would be unknown. This is a fascinating look into the underworld of the pre-commissioned five-family Italian-American mob days. According to John Shilatani, his goal was to offer this unique gangster story to all. This one-of-a-kind gangster story is unique, rare, and untold until now. Walk in the footsteps of one of the baddest men to walk on the face of this planet, all 4 foot 1 3/4 inches of him. He was a prize fighter and an automatic pistol expert with both hands. Uncovered for the first time, this astonishing true story reveals the gripping 1910 saga of murder and mayhem on Mulberry Street. The deaths of many men were on his hands. Just how many notches were on the Colt automatic he treasured, we may never know. He was responsible for one of the largest manhunts in the history of New York City. He was the only one to ever survive and escape from the death house at the world's most notorious prison, Sing Sing, at that time. So, this was the story of his great-uncle, Oresto Shilatani. I would describe the night of the murders from the newspaper articles in the World that I kept and cite in the introduction to my memoir or this podcast. But John Shilatani's description that night from Gangster Original provides more vivid detail, particularly from pages 48 to 53 of his story. He describes it in this way. It was grand opening night, and the band was playing at Parato's Cafe. By all accounts, a beautiful Saturday night on May 3rd, 1913. The drinks and food were complimentary to all. The kid, that is, the Paperbox Kid, or Oresto Shilatani, just pasted a crisp $2 bill on the place's mirror. The combination pool room and cafe at 235 Mulberry Street was packed with gangsters getting free food and drinks. A raging gangster party right in the heart of gangland, packed with old-time gangsters downing free brew in one of the most vicious and toughest parts of the great metropolis. These guys weren't the typical armed rabble-rousers that couldn't shoot straight. These guys from downtown were first-rate murderers and the most dangerous gangsters in all of New York City. All were born in filth and squalor, according to Shilatani, but the guys on Mulberry Street came with connected families. They could live in nicer places, but they didn't. They chose to be with and were more comfortably living with and amongst the vermin, their job to guard and to protect the territories that they stalked out on their own. Most of the area gangsters had the brains of donkeys with dementia and the foresight of a ship in dense fog. But the men from this part of Mulberry Street were a breed apart and far cry from the aforementioned. Sharp in wit, expert with weapons, and versatile with illegal, illegitimate, or unlawful acts. Now, the Kid, or the Rizzo, known as Kid Morgan, was a gangster from Mott Street and a strikebreaker. He was a Sicilian gangster who strutted around downtown like he was a cut above the rest. He and his pals wore sharp suits, and they sported sleek hairstyles. He and his fellow gangmen were in the pool room when Rizzo displayed utmost disrespect to the Kid's father. Rizzo had pissed off Shilatani's Khmer gang by buying a pistol and not paying for it. The rumor on the streets was that Rizzo was or used the unpaid gun to shoot and seriously wound a striker at 447 Broadway. After the shooting, Rizzo got rid of the gun and quickly jumped on a train to flee the scene of the crime. Instead of being a stand-up guy, Rizzo borrowed the gun, got rid of it, and didn't pay for it. Being a strikebreaker, he was bigger than most and stood over his comrades. Michele, Oresto's father, noticed Rizzo in the pool room and quickly approached him. Michele already knew from A to Z the story about the gun, demanded payment and respect. It showed flagrant disrespect not to report the status of the payment to the big man. Rizzo was flushed with drink and tried to downplay Michele's questions. Michele continued as the old traditional Italians would do, and Rizzo, drunk, laughed off the unpaid debt, scoffed at Michele's concerns, and pushed him with a pool stick. Michele, unknown as a wealthy, or I should say known really, as a wealthy and powerful man on Mulberry Street, was at first in disbelief, and then angered beyond any string of the worst Italian sayings or gestures that accompany such a verbal assault. This very public display of disrespect was a major violation of, and by, the code Michele lived by. Michele, sternly under partial control, exits the fine establishment and walks next door to the saloon at 233 Mulberry Street, another Shilatani-owned building where Oresto was known to hang out. Michele informs him of the events that took place in the pool room. After handing Oresto the .38, Michele walks across the street for a front row view of the slaughter. He waits standing tall, chest out, chin up, and arms folded for the enforcement of Rizzo's death sentence. It was customary for an old-time gangster to watch the lamb walk into the slaughter. Lambs that couldn't be herded and controlled had to be slaughtered, or wolves would pick up its scent and lead to the slaughter of the rest. Now, according to John Shilatani and Gangster Original, Oresto is now fully armed with a .32 ACP and a .38 ACP, waiting for the brazen gangster, one of Rizzo's compadres, warns Rizzo really, that Oresto was outside still waiting for him. Rizzo, playing the tough guy, took his time and walked slowly outside, as if he already knew his fate. To show confidence in front of his pool room comrades, Rizzo stands up with a straight wobble and turns to the guys. "The kid's on his last legs. I might as well finish him up." Rizzo walks to the door slowly as his buddies follow. Rizzo gets outside of the doors and walks towards where Oresto is standing on a railing in front of 241 Mulberry Street, not far from my apartment at 247. Rizzo came out of the pool room at 2:35 and started walking toward 2:39. Oresto sees him and immediately comes off his perch and walks towards Rizzo. They meet in front of 239 Mulberry Street. If there was any question about this being a death sentence by public execution, the testimony at the trial clearly illustrates, according to John Shilatani. Oresto is waiting by the railing at 241 Mulberry Street for Rizzo after challenging him to come outside. The father, Michele, went inside 241 Mulberry, where he lived, and returned with the nickel-plated .38 ACP, a shiny object, and handed it to Arresto. The father of Michele walks across the street and faces the scene as it is about to unfold. Arresto walks toward John Rizzo, while Michele waits for justice. When Arresto meets Rizzo, they are in front of 239 Mulberry Street. A shot is fired, and Rizzo drops dead to the ground. Justice is served, street style. The sentence is consummated. Meanwhile, across the street and a few buildings up, a patrolman of New York City's 12th precinct was on the beat. A young probationary rookie officer named William Heaney was pulling on doors, ensuring the shopkeepers had locked up properly for the night. Heaney's post was on Mulberry Street between Spring and Bleecker. It was only 30 minutes or so from the end of the shift, from 4 p.m. to 12 p.m. that night. As the kid and Morelli are dragging Rizzo's body back toward the pool hall, Arresto signals for a second gangster to take over and help Morelli bring Rizzo's body back into the pool hall. Once shots were heard, it only took a matter of seconds for Officer Heaney to realize where and what had happened. The brave young officer wrapped the leather from his blackjack tightly around his fist, blew his whistle, and ran into the face of extreme danger, without hesitation, toward 235 Mulberry Street, the combination pool room and cafe. After hearing the whistle of a patrolman from across the street, Arresto decided it was time to make his clean break. With quickness and agility, Officer Heaney intercepted the kid in his flight from justice. Heaney pulls back on his blackjack and with a mighty strike blasts the kid on his head right above the ear. The kid impulsively reacts the only way he knew how. 3 shots rang out, and the young officer fell immediately to the ground. And in an instant, his career and life would come to an abrupt end.